On Sunday the 11th of September 2022, a woman was arrested in Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland. Her crime? Holding a piece of paper on which she'd written, "Flip imperialism, abolish monarchy." Her arrest was one of several such incidents in the days following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. At least 2 others were detained by police for holding signs or verbally objecting during proclamation ceremonies for the new King Charles. And in London, one man was even threatened with arrest for simply holding a blank sheet of paper on which he'd suggested that he might write the words, "Not my king." Locking people up for exercising their right to peaceful protest is rarely a great look for the police, but these arrests were particularly ludicrous for quite how reserved and even lackluster the supposed crimes were. These were isolated individuals whose protests were almost a parody of reserved, deferential Britishness. There was no burning of effigies or climbing of street furniture, just static, non-threatening sign-holding. Perhaps predictably, once news of these arrests made the rounds on social media, further activists headed out in solidarity. Several clips emerged of King Charles being booed by his new subjects. But in the grand scheme of things, these protests remained pretty small. This quietism and lack of coordination is fairly reflective of British republicanism. Republicanism here meaning opposition to the monarchy rather than Joe Biden is a secret drag queen or whatever. When asked by pollsters, somewhere between a quarter and just over a third of UK residents say they have a negative view of the monarchy. But attempts to convert this sentiment into a popular campaign to abolish the institution have consistently failed to attract anyone outside of the most dedicated enthusiasts. One stumbling block is perhaps the lack of a clear vision for what the monarchy might be replaced with. Because love the royals or hate them, the monarchy plays a pivotal role in British politics. Constitutionally speaking, the power and political legitimacy of the British government, parliament, armed forces and police all originate in the monarch themselves and is delegated to those institutions through various laws and conventions. Even if a majority of Brits could be convinced that the monarchy should be abolished, then they would still need to agree on what exactly might replace it, which would probably prove a challenge. But British republicanism hasn't always lacked a clear plan for what the country might look like without a monarchy. In fact, one of the founding figures of modern anti-monarchism worldwide was, for his sins, British. Today, I want to tell you the story of that British Republican. A man who so hated the idea of hereditary monarchy that he inspired a revolution in America, helped bring down the monarchy in France, and had the British establishment so terrified he might inspire a similar movement in the UK that his books were burned and his followers rounded up by the authorities. This video is part of a mini-series which I'm releasing over the next few weeks, which I'm calling Treason Fest 2023. As we approach the coronation of Charles III, an event I'm obviously deeply looking forward to, the plan is to release a handful of slightly shorter than usual videos which foreground the stories of various Brits from over the years who have tried, with varying degrees of success, to consign the British crown to history. Today, we turn our attention to the age of revolution, and perhaps the British monarchy's biggest ever hater, a man called Thomas Paine. then, let's overthrow some monarchies, shall we? So a lot that happened in Thomas Paine's life was kind of improbable. He was, in some ways, the 18th century's answer to Forrest Gump. Every time he seemed to have participated in his last major world event, or met his last influential historical figure, he'd just turn the corner and bam! Suddenly he's having dinner with Napoleon. You've no idea how many high-quality hijinks I had to cut from this video to keep it at an even vaguely respectable length. But, like Forrest Gump, Thomas Paine's life started in relative obscurity. Paine was born in 1737, in the small town of Thetford, in the east of England. And from a very young age, he was acutely aware of how brutal the society around him could be. Gazing out of the window of his house, he would have been able to see a spot called Gallows Hill. Nowadays, Gallows Hill is home to a roundabout and a large industrial estate, which maybe seems bleak enough. But in the 1730s, its name was literal. It was the spot on which the town executed its criminals. I say criminals, but those who hanged were often just people who had fallen on hard times, and who were being punished for acts of sheer desperation. In the year Tom Paine was born, for example, one man was executed for having stolen a single parcel of tea. Which, what's more British than having a dude barbarically murdered by the state for stealing your brew? It's unsurprising then that the young Thomas Paine was desperate to escape. At 19 years old, he packed his bags, left Thetford, and spent the next few years trying out a whole bunch of pretty diverse careers. The standout position on this list was the time that he spent as a privateer, aboard a ship called the King of Prussia. A privateer was somewhere between a naval mercenary and a legalised pirate. Think Blackwater Security meets Dog the Bounty Hunter, but on the high seas. Yardy har har. Maybe we should do a pirates video, just for it's the only accent I can do. Paine would have spent his days helping to hunt down and capture French merchant ships, which could then be sold on and the profits split between the crew. Nevertheless, Paine doesn't seem to have taken all that well to the seafaring lifestyle, and after just 6 months, he was back on dry land, where he did a complete 180. Trading in the morally questionable exploits of the privateer for a gig as a customs officer, trying to catch smugglers on England's south coast. Although he was now working for the king, some aspect of his time at sea seemed to have stuck with Paine. Living among sailors likely contributed further to the political awareness that had begun with noticing bodies swinging in the breeze on Gallows Hill. Sailors at the time, many of whom were forced into service by either poverty or the press gang, were known to be a pretty revolutionary bunch, and Paine no doubt picked up a few new ideas from his fellow seamen. I'm going to refrain from making a joke there. This rabble-rousing streak would come in handy when, in 1772, Paine's fellow customs officers decided that they were going to demand a pay rise. Or, to put it another way, Tommy used to work on the docks, the union went on strike, he was down on his luck. It was tough. So tough. So he said we've got to write a letter to Parliament outlining our grievances. Or maybe someone else suggested sending a letter, but Paine got charged with actually writing it. At the age of 35 then, Thomas Paine wrote his first political pamphlet. Titled The Case of the Officers of Excise, it argued that raising wages wasn't only good for the customs officers themselves, but also for the country, as it would stop officers from having to take bribes from smugglers in order to make ends meet. As first essays go, it was a pretty solid piece of work. You know, in my professional opinion as someone who creates YouTube videos, this work by noted writer Thomas Paine is like a solid C. He likely felt pretty optimistic as he travelled to London to hand the petition over to Parliament. And when he got there, yeah, they sacked him. This was the 1700s. The government wasn't about to sit down and negotiate with the 18th century equivalent of one of the folks from Nothing to Declare.
Right, basically we've got a female passenger who's come in from Turkey and she's got 1,800 cigarettes.
Being fired for simply asking for a pay rise only helped to confirm Paine's growing belief that the country around him was not only unequal, but fundamentally unjust. However, at this point, it wasn't as though he had any real path to changing that. He thus scheduled a meeting with a friend that he'd made during a previous spell in London. And that man's name was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin suggested that Paine put his hopes for inciting revolution in Britain to one side for a minute, and travel instead to America, where rebels were about to be in hot demand. Paine arrived in Philadelphia in 1774, and quickly found work as the editor of a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Journal. And there was a lot of news to cover. The Boston Tea Party had already happened nearly a whole year before Paine stepped off the boat, and political tensions were high. That being said, at this point, most colonists simply wanted to negotiate a more just and equitable deal with King George III. Few had given thought to outright independence. All of that was to change in April 1775, when fighting broke out between British soldiers and local militiamen in Massachusetts. A series of skirmishes in Lexington and Concord turned what had previously been simply political disputes over taxation into an outright conflict. And few were impacted emotionally and intellectually by this bloodshed more than Thomas Paine. Just a real empath was our Tom. Now, it might seem weird that a man who had only been in America for about 6 months at this point ended up throwing himself so fully behind the cause of American independence. But Paine identified that the brutally high taxes forced upon the American colonists were an outcome of the very same political system which led to starving people being hanged in England. Drawing on his now considerable writing experience, Paine set about composing a pamphlet called Common Sense. The document argued that reconciliation with Britain was now impossible. The only way forward for America was full independence. Partly, he argued, this would be more practical. It simply made no sense to be ruled by a tiny island on the other side of the world. Yet the primary target of Paine's outrage was not so much Britain as a country, but instead the system of monarchy which lay at its core. Paine framed hereditary monarchy as a frankly ridiculous way of running a country. He argued that an independent America, which he suggested might be called the United States of America, should abolish the outdated system of monarchy in favour of a democratic congressional system headed by an elected president. Common Sense was a runaway success. If you lived in America in 1776, were literate and had the spare cash, there's a strong chance that you bought a copy. It was everywhere. It was like the How to Win Friends and Influence People, or The Tipping Point, or 12 Rules for Life of its day. But, you know, good. Of course, we have to be careful not to place too much importance on any individual book in changing the course of history. But Common Sense undoubtedly played a key role in building popular support for the American Revolution. It also established the eradication of monarchy as one of the rebellion's core ideals. Throughout the war which followed, Thomas Paine continued to write in support of the revolutionary cause. He also got stuck in himself, enlisting in the Continental Army and later negotiating support from France, which would prove crucial in defeating the British. When the war was done and independence achieved, however, Paine quickly found himself cast aside. Despite helping to inspire the revolution, naming the new country, and partly designing its system of government, Paine was never in the core circle of founding fathers. He was likely too poor and far too radical. Alongside his denunciations of monarchy, Paine had suggested that the first item on the United States agenda should be abolishing slavery, which, yeah, the rest of the group just weren't that keen on. After a brief period knocking around New York then, he decided to call it quits and return to England. Now, personally, I can't help but feel that this was a bit of a bold move. If I just played a pivotal role in inspiring a war against my home country, I feel like maybe I wouldn't go back. Call me a coward, but even if I did go back, I'd probably keep a pretty low profile. At the very, very least, I would be cautious about trying to incite a similar revolution back home. But Thomas Paine really hated the monarchy. The important context here is that just 2 years after Paine returned to the UK, France decided to follow America's example and have a little revolution of their own. The storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July 1789 obviously caused something of a commotion in France itself. But it also terrified the British ruling class. They feared that revolutionary sentiment was getting closer and closer, and that a similar revolt might be on the cards in Britain. The man who best captured the mood of the British establishment in this moment was the politician and philosopher Edmund Burke. In November 1790, Burke published a pamphlet titled Reflections on the Revolution in France. I say pamphlet, but it was actually a full 400 pages long. Reflections on the Revolution in France was, in some regards, the world's first Why I Left the Left post. See, Burke had originally been something of a liberal and had actively supported the revolutionaries in America. But where the American Revolution had been led by the property-owning middle classes, the French Revolution was a much more proletarian affair. And Burke declared that handing power over to what he called the swinish multitude was a recipe for disaster. Not unlike the online ramblings of modern-day conservatives, Burke's reflections inspired an avalanche of response pieces from contemporary liberals. The feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft released a takedown titled A Vindication of the Rights of Men, which she would follow with her more famous Vindication of the Rights of Women a few years later. And it didn't take long before Thomas Paine decided that he'd offer up his thoughts on the matter too. The resulting book was called Rights of Man, and was published in 2 parts. The first was a fairly straightforward defence of the French Revolution. Paine argued that the French and American revolutions were both part of a necessary global reorganisation of society, in which monarchy and aristocracy were being left behind in favour of democracy, reason and justice. The second book, however, went further. Firstly, Paine was far more cutting in his dunks on George III. He writes at one point that it requires some talents to be a common mechanic, but to be a king requires only the animal figure of man, a sort of breathing automaton. He also suggested that it might actually be a good thing if revolution were to spread to further countries within Europe. Finally, he was bold enough to set out a vision for how those countries, including the UK, might work once they had overthrown their monarchies. This plan didn't only involve the installation of a much fuller democracy, but also progressive taxation and a welfare system to improve the conditions of the poor. Much like Common Sense before it, Rights of Man was a smash hit bestseller. In many ways, it was the communist manifesto of its day. Whether you agreed with Paine's Republican arguments or not, it was obligatory reading. And Paine himself quickly became a hero to the increasing number of revolutionary debating groups which were springing up across the United Kingdom. In fact, for Paine himself, Rights of Man was perhaps a little too successful. The British government, already terrified of revolution breaking out, made selling or possessing the book illegal. They whipped up royalist mobs who burnt copies of the book along with effigies of Paine. When the government decided to simply arrest him, however, he was tipped off, supposedly by the romantic poet William Blake, and managed to flee across the Channel to France in the nick of time. In his absence, the government conducted a show trial, in which Paine was charged with seditious libel, a crime which made it illegal to advocate for the overthrow of the government. They didn't even try that hard to make the hearing look legit. The jury actually stopped the trial after the opening statement and declared that they'd heard enough to pass a guilty verdict already. Paine's sentence was to be declared an outlaw, which sounds pretty badass, but kind of meant being the subject of a targeted one-person purge, in which you were considered to be outside of the protections of the law. Anyone could do anything to you without fear of punishment, including just straight up murdering you. At this point, Paine did realise that returning to the UK was probably off the cards. But Thomas Paine being Thomas Paine, he didn't just flee to France and keep his head down. There was a revolution to get involved in after all. In fact, the day before he arrived, the country had held an election for its first Republican government, and Paine stepped off the boat in Calais to find that he'd been elected as a representative for 3 separate towns. Paine's experience in France was pretty mixed. His hatred of monarchs everywhere meant that he argued strongly for placing the deposed Louis XVI on trial. However, his lifelong opposition to the death penalty meant that he also opposed the king's execution. So strongly did he argue to save Louis's life that he eventually came under suspicion as a counter-revolutionary and ended up imprisoned in the Luxembourg Palace, before eventually returning to America to retire. But what of the Republican Revolution that he'd called for back in Britain? Well, obviously Britain didn't abolish its monarchy in the 18th century. It is very much still there. I mean, I sort of wouldn't really be making this video without it, I guess. So, at least we all got some content out of it. But what's often overlooked are the significant lengths that the British government went to in order to keep it in place. Because they did not stop at forcing Thomas Paine into exile. In fact, the Prime Minister, William Pitt, was so terrified at the rise in revolutionary sentiment that he set up a secret government committee to suppress radical and republican societies. He even persuaded Parliament to suspend habeas corpus. That's the legal doctrine which gives people protection from wrongful arrest and the right to a fair trial. This allowed the authorities to arrest anyone they wished without reason. And they did. During the 1790s, scores of people were prosecuted and jailed for the mere crime of possessing political pamphlets. The climax of this brutal crackdown on Republican sentiment in Britain, however, came in 1794, when Pitt's government orchestrated a series of treason trials against leading radicals. These trials didn't exactly go to plan, as jurors actually voted to acquit all 3 of the highest profile defendants. Nevertheless, all of these authoritarian actions combined served as a clear demonstration for how far the government could and would go to stamp out progressive ideals. Most radicals, Republicans and Democrats were quickly scared into silence. Some of their calls, such as extending the right to vote to those without property, would have to wait centuries to be answered. Others, such as Thomas Paine's defiant vision for a Britain without a king or queen, still remain on the country's to-do list. But before I go any further, many of you will know that I recently launched a podcast. And as I mentioned in the announcement video for that show, I found the process of doing so equal parts incredibly exciting and also deeply terrifying. See, I've always really suffered from perfectionism, which I always think sounds like a humble brag, but really isn't. I can spend hours drafting and redrafting sections of these videos, which were probably fine after only a few minutes of tinkering. But I've recently been developing some strategies to overcome the self-doubt and self-criticism which fuels that perfectionism with a bit of help from Skillshare, which is kindly sponsoring today's video. You might already know Skillshare for its classes in video editing, illustration and writing. But Skillshare has hundreds of career-focused classes too. I found myself getting loads out of Emma Gannon's class on what she calls creative confidence. Among several strategies, it encouraged me to share my work slightly more often and earlier than I previously would have, which has usually resulted in a real confidence boost about the project I'm working on and my skills as a writer more generally. And in addition to this, she also had loads of thoughts on imposter syndrome and fear of self-promotion, which are both also things that I occasionally struggle with. Skillshare is offering 1 month for free to any of my viewers who use the link in the description box below. And for the month of April only, they're running an even better offer. If you're ready to start learning with Skillshare today, then you can get 40% off your first year using my link. If you want to join me in learning on Skillshare, then I'll leave both links down below so that you can choose which offer is best for you. Thank you so much once again to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Now, on with the show. In March 2023, Charles III was due to visit France on what would have been his first state visit as king. In the week prior, however, the French and British governments made the decision to postpone the trip. Mass unrest had broken out in Paris in response to the revelation that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, was planning to raise the country's official retirement age from 62 years old to 64. The contrast to the timidity of the protests I mentioned at the beginning of this video were stark. And their scale inspired many on UK social media to draw comparisons between the French people's record of bringing their entire country to a standstill at the slightest hint that their rights might be encroached upon, and a supposed corresponding tendency on the part of Brits to just suck it up and take it. Many, perhaps logically, drew attention to the country's histories, and the fact that France had a successful 18th century revolution in which it lopped the head off its king, whilst many in Britain still worship ours. Yet, the fact that Britain didn't join France in abolishing its monarchy in the 18th century doesn't mean that no one wanted to. As we've seen, Thomas Paine was a defiant critic of the institution and perhaps the British monarchy's most dedicated hater ever. But he wasn't alone. Britain's failure to follow America and France to revolution wasn't a result of Brits being somehow inherently deferential, but the outcome of a brutal authoritarian crackdown by the government of the time. None of this provides today's anti-monarchists with a simple plan for abolishing the monarchy in the present. That is yet to be drawn up. But it does highlight that highly popular movements seeking to do so have existed in the past, and therefore could very much exist again in the future. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have found it enjoyable or interesting in some way. If you want to support me to make more videos like this, then you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. And if you do, you will be joining these brilliant people who are currently signed up to the top tier of that Patreon, which includes Richard, Alan Gann, Gary, Dick on Spain, Bill Mitchell, ZC Reese, Alexander Blank, Neil to Bildgard, Sophia R, Nicholas Jacquemart, Strange Weekend, Ricardo Fernandez de Cordoba, Richard Rapoon, Amit Singh Parahar, Gabriel Koch, Demelza, Jimmy Dunn, Christopher Cowan, TK Loving, and Fiasco Linguini. If you want to join them in getting early access to videos, copies of scripts to them, weekly updates in terms of what I'm up to, and much more, then you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thanks so much